Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Managing Occasional Invaders, the Unwanted and Unwelcome Guests, brought to you by Pest Management Professional Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Control Solutions, Inc. I'm Ellen from North Coast Media, the digital editor for PMP Magazine, and I will be your event manager for today's presentation. At this time, I'd like you to get comfortable with our console and the ways you can participate during today's presentation. Before we begin, please notice the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand side of your console. If you have a question, type it in the panel's text box, then click Submit to place your question in the queue. You may also use the hashtag PMPWebinar on Twitter to submit questions during today's webinar or to enter into discussions with other attendees. We encourage you to continue to ask questions during any time during the presentation for our speaker. We will address these questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A portion. Questions will be submitted during the registration, have already gone to our speaker, and may be covered at the end of the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, you may use the same Q&A panel on your screen to submit your issue. Our technical support specialist, Hallie, or I will personally assist you. Finally, you may learn more about today's speakers by viewing their photo, bio, and contact information on the panel located on the right-hand side of your console. To earn CEU credits, you must attend the live webinar for the full duration. You must type in code words when appropriate during the presentation as well. You must log in and interact with the live webinar as an individual, not as a group. You must have indicated during registration that you were attending the webinar for credit and included your license number. If you are unsure if you made that indication or provided your license number, please email your license number to Trinity Bresner at controlsolutionsinc.com before the webinar begins. For those in New Jersey, use the same email to email Trinity a photo of themselves and their ID on the day of the webinar, only and only before the webinar begins. After the webinar, complete the mandatory quiz as soon as possible. We have no audio. Okay.
I can hear you, Ellen.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, does the audience have it? I'll keep, after the webinar, complete the mandatory quiz as soon as possible, and the quiz link will be available on mypmp.net/webinar shortly after the quiz is complete. When the webinar is complete and until September 14th, you will be able to have access to the quiz. You will receive your certification if you meet all the requirements 2 to 3 weeks after September 15th. If you have any issues, contact Trinity at .bresner@controlsolutionsinc.com. As more states are approved, some states may have state-specific requirements. Please stay tuned in the webinar registration page for any additional information. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Brittany Campbell, BCE, who is Technical Services Manager at Control Solutions, Inc. Brittany has over 11 years of experience in the pest control industry. Most recently, she was the Director of Technical Services for a national association representing pest control companies. She has extensive experience in research, insecticide resistance, and insect biology, especially bed bugs. In addition, she is passionate about pest control education, training, and stewardship. She is a member of the Entomological Society of America and a Pi Chi Omega, a fraternity for pest management professionals. Heather Patterson is a PCO Technical Services Manager at Control Solutions, Inc. Heather Patterson brings in a unique background and pest management experience earned while working in the 10-plus years on her family-owned golf course and cow-calf operations in Florida. These experiences led Patterson to the University of Florida, where she received her bachelor's and master's degrees in entomology with a specialization in urban pest management. During her time as a student, she conducted research on critical pests of our industry, including bedbugs, cockroaches, and mosquitoes. Following her time at the University of Florida, she joined Control Solutions, Inc. and gained several years of product development experience as a project manager on the R&D team. In her current role, Patterson works with the university researchers and industry cooperators to test products and build data packages. She also supports CSI sales and marketing teams and the pest management industry on behalf of CSI. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Brittany. Brittany, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Ellen. And first, I just have to start out. It really takes a team to put one of these things on, everybody. So a huge shout out to Ellen. We have Haley from PMP Magazine in the background, and there's just so much work. We've got like 5 people in the background. We also have Trinity, Myra with my CSI team, who helps to put together all of the CEU credits for you guys today. So aside from Heather and I speaking, there's so many moving parts. So thanks so much to PMP Magazine and everyone else who makes this possible today for us to talk a little bit about occasional invaders. So with that, I will jump in. So I really want to take this big picture first. So if we zoom out before we really start defining occasional invaders, and how do we even decide as entomologists what is an occasional invader? And honestly, sometimes we argue, scientists argue, it's hard to define and put bugs into groups, and we'll talk about it. But first, let's just define what is a pest. A pest to me may be different to someone else. Of course, many of the bugs that people think are pests, I might allow to live in my house as an entomologist because I don't really, you know, if it's not a termite eating my house or something, I might be cool with a little ground beetle here or there. And so a pest to some people, it might be a family member. You might have a nosy grandmother. Not all of us are blessed with the wonderful, gracious grandmother. So it could be someone who has a lot of opinions for you that you don't quite appreciate. Or in my world, it's a neighbor. I love my neighbors. I have these neighbors, they're in their 70s, bless their hearts, nicest people, but their lifestyle's different from mine right now, right? I'm in my mid-30s. I have a full-time demanding job. I travel a decent amount for work, so my time's very limited. So if I go outside to try to garden, get my mail, I just want to like go outside. I want to hurry, get back inside. And my neighbors want to talk and hang out. So love them, but sometimes they're pests because I just have very limited time, right? So a pest is going to be defined by humans, by a person. What is bothering us? And it may differ from person to person. And so if you go to the dictionary, you look up just general overall definition of a pest. It's an annoying person or thing, a nuisance. But if we dive into this a little bit more, we have to think about pests from our perspective, industry. So a structural pest, what does that mean? Well, when we talk about structural pests, we're of course talking about a pest that's going to attack structures, like again, termites. Also maybe a pest that destroys and eats food. So our pantry pests, our Indian meal moths, our cigarette beetles, right? So pests of our food, pests that may contaminate our food. And then also what is missing from this slide, another pest group, when we're trying to group our bugs into a general category so we can define them and kind of treat them separately, you have your public health pests, right? So you have your mosquitoes, you have your bed bugs, and other pests that can transmit disease, or their bites can cause allergic reactions. For various reasons, we consider them a public health pest. But when we break it down even more, when we're talking about occasional invaders, I want to take it back. That original definition of what is a pest, just straight definition of a nuisance, is kind of where our occasional invaders go. When we start trying to group them into this category, sometimes it's just the bugs that aren't eating the house or the bugs that aren't spreading disease, but they get into our house. Like, how do we even group them? Taxonomists, they go through a lot of work looking at different characteristics of a bug and DNA, but really an occasional invader, sometimes it's just like this, what is this other bug? What is this bug? I don't know. Well, we might throw it in the occasional invader pile or overwintering pest pile. But there's some key characteristics that we use to kind of define our occasional invaders and to put them into a group. And one of those is, well, do they accidentally wander into a building? But another big one is that typically they are not going to reproduce indoors, and they are not going to complete their life cycle indoors. So unlike your German roaches and other, even some of your peri-domestic roaches, like your Americans, bigger cockroaches, may reproduce, you know, in a basement or something. However, but for the most part, when we're talking occasional invaders, they're not going to reproduce indoors. And even if we lump in those overwintering pests, so think like your stink bugs, your Asian lady beetles, they are going to come inside as adults to overwinter, but they're not going to reproduce, right? They're going to leave in the springtime, temperatures warm up, those overwintering pests are going to pop out of the house, and then they're going to reproduce elsewhere, start laying their eggs, so not completing their life cycle indoors. It's typically how we try to kind of group these occasional invaders. And occasional invaders most often are going to be a symptom of something that is going on in the environment. So as far as lighting goes, if you have super attractive lighting, can bring pests in, especially a lot of the occasional invaders, which are typically going to be outdoors. And moisture is going to be a big one. You are going to be so tired of us talking about moisture today, because honestly, you kind of have to like beat it over the head when it comes to moisture and occasional invaders, because this is such a large component or conducive condition that attracts all these random bugs into the house. And then we also have construction, right? And a lot of these things can apply to a lot of our pests. But if we have older construction, if we have siding that has been moved away from the house, if we have settling of concrete, so the concrete up to the foundation, maybe there's some cracks there settling over time. So older construction issues are always going to be a conducive condition, because as soon as you have those gaps, those cracks and crevices, all those holes that allow these overwintering pests to come in or occasional invaders to come in, it's obviously going to cause issues indoors. And we always want to think about many of these pests as outdoor pests, as doing a preventative pest management strategy. So focusing on the outdoors to kind of keep them out, right? Keep them from coming in. And then landscaping is going to be a huge factor. So, you know, if you are treating an area, for those of you in the Northeast, you may be dealing with some woods roaches. So if you go up to a house and they're in a forested area, they may have a lot more bugs that potentially come in, more beetles and stuff. So opportunity for more occasional invaders because of the environment. Whereas in an urban landscape, less foliage, you may be dealing with different pests as well. So understanding your geography, what are the common pests? So understanding the very common structural pests. So if you do get a weird one-off bug, then you can say, oh, this is probably just an occasional invader. There's not a lot of, there's not several bugs aggregating here. We're only seeing one or two. This is not a common bug that I see. So then you can tell your customer, I think this bug just accidentally moved into your structure, moved into your home. And then weather. So referring to these overwintering pests that are sometimes lumped in as occasional invaders, but other pests as well, like millipedes. Millipedes, you get these crazy large migrations, right, sometimes, and that can be due to, you know, not enough water. Sometimes super rainy events can cause these migrations, but weather plays a very important factor for many of the pests that we talk about today. So as soon as there's temperature changes, fewer hours of sunlight, it starts to get a little bit cooler. That is going to spur a lot of insects to start thinking, oh no, it's almost time for me to diapause. It's time for me to take a nap. Maybe it's time for me to overwinter. So rain, precipitation, all of these factors kind of tell insects it's time for me to move away from the outside. And then we have our buildings here that provide excellent shelter for bugs. So a lot of times it may be bugs that are looking for shelter that occasionally wander in. And then, honestly, sometimes it's just for the heck of it. There's no rhyme or reason. A bug is wandering around aimlessly outside. Again, it could be structure. We don't, you know, we can't ask the bug, hey, why'd you come in here? But sometimes literally it seems for the heck of it. On their path to wherever they were going, they encountered this very large building. Looked like maybe there was a dark area. Maybe there was some moisture here. But for sometimes we literally can't define, and we can't tell the customers, I don't know exactly why you have this very uncommon pest. And sometimes it literally feels like for the heck of it. But as we group these insects in, again, as occasional invaders, there, again, are some commonalities that we can kind of pick out and define and say, hey, this is an occasional invader. So again, if they do come indoors, a lot of times they do have high moisture requirements. A lot of these insects and arthropods live in the outdoor environment. So as soon as they get into a structure, the humidity is not where it needs to be for them to survive. The conditions aren't great. If we have put down pesticides, of course, that could kill them as soon as they come indoors. But a lot of times we're really talking about the environment that we have inside that's not conducive to some of these pests. So they come inside, they dry out, they die quickly. We don't have the food, the resources that they may typically feed on indoors. And again, not completing their life cycle. So they're not going to reproduce indoors. They're not going to go from egg to whatever, nymph or whatever their life cycle is completely. And these insects or arthropods are typically non-destructive and not public health pests, so not medically important. So if we bring it full circle back to that first definition of a pest, it kind of applies to occasional invaders. They are literally, for the most part, not really important pests from the perspective that they're not contaminating the food, they're not gobbling our food down, they're not spreading disease, making us sick, they're not doing anything to our structure, they're literally just annoying. And then our customers may define them as annoying if they have a low tolerance for any type of insect in their home, or they are seeing multiple of the same pests. So if there are several millipedes that come in, seeing them in multiple areas, then of course this could become alarming to our customers. So we have to talk to our customers and figure out their definition of what is alarming them, and then also alleviate some of their fears by saying, hey, this bug doesn't really bite. This bug it's not going to eat your wood or anything in your house. So communicating that to them to alleviate some of the fears so they understand, hey, you know what? We can try to caulk up every crack I've ever seen, but at the end of the day, it's going to be impossible to prevent everything, right? So having that understanding with your customers as well. It's like, we'll do what we can on the outside. If I see this large deficiency, this large crack, let me see if I can seal it up, or look at your weep holes, whatever it is. But again, communicating that to the customer. And occasional invaders typically are going to come from the environment, right? So they are pests that are living outside, not typically, for the most part, for many of them. I mean, you may bring some of these occasional invaders in with your packages or food deliveries, whatever. But a lot of times, several of these pests that we define as occasional invaders are just outside in the environment. So they're hanging out in trees, on landscaping, potentially in the grass. And then again, the lighting is a huge issue with many occasional invaders, because the lights outside attract a ton of pests. So you can get a lot of diversity from lighting. So for us entomologists, we all had to make a bug collection. So literally a box of dead bugs that we went out and collected. Guess what? Where do you think we got those bugs from? I spent, and Heather on this call too, I'm sure, spent many hours hanging out at gas stations, always have super bright lights that are very attractive to bugs, large commercial warehouses. So there were literally like buildings, commercial buildings that we identified that had crazy bright lights that were attractive to bugs. And we would go hang out underneath these lights at nighttime and collect bugs. So lighting, again, going to be a huge factor for attracting bugs. And I always really want to emphasize inspection. As far as a pest control service goes, the inspection to me is the most important part. So it's not the treatment. You determine what treatment you're going to do. And of course, that's a matter of solving the problem, but you can't get to the treatment stage. You can't really determine what you should do, what bug you're dealing with. It's biology until you do a great inspection. And of course, everyone should invest in a very good bright flashlight. And you should also have questions in your back pocket for every single account. So you have standard questions that you go to. So always, how long have you been seeing this activity? Where have you been seeing this activity? Ask the customer to walk you around, show you where they're seeing the activity, because you will have the eye for, oh, there's activity here, but I happen to notice that there is this like water hose that's leaking, you know? So the customer's not going to understand all the conducive conditions behind why there is that activity. And another one that I like to commonly ask, and this is just, you know, 3, there's tons of other questions you can ask as well, but is, have there been any renovations, any changes to the structure? Because this can be a biggie too for any areas that potentially could have pest entry. And it just kind of depends. Sometimes you may start from the outside, or maybe your company, depends on your company protocol. Maybe you're mostly doing exterior treatments. If you walk up, start talking to the customer, you may do inside first. But all I have to say there is follow a protocol, have it standardized so you don't miss any area. You don't want to just like willy-nilly be like, oh, I'm going to go to the left side of the house here, look at this real quick, and then I'm going to kind of skip the front for a second, go off to the right. Of course, we want to go in a circular pattern. So if you start from left to right, start with the foundation and then go further out from the building, look for those resource sites. But just make sure you're working in a very strategic, standard way of going around a property so you don't miss any potential pest areas. And I'm a huge proponent for occasional invaders, putting out sticky traps, obviously kind of trying to put them in areas where you expect activity, maybe further away from some doors and areas as well, where you might get some of those non-targets that we don't want to catch in our sticky traps. But sticky traps will be huge for us to quickly go in and see what kind of pests activity we're having, identify some of those pests, and capture those pests, of course, when we're not there present doing our inspection. And one of the biggies, one of the problems we have with occasional invaders is there's a million insects on planet Earth. No one can identify them all, myself included, not even probably a quarter of them. But occasional invaders require that we have some knowledge of a lot of different types of pests. And with that said, there's not going to be a one-fits-all answer. And a lot of this is going to be repetitive, like focusing on moisture, you know, some exclusion tactics, and really focusing on those perimeter applications, but also understanding biology, where these pests are coming from, what they may feed on, is going to help us with our treatment solutions as well. So let's dive in. I want to take just a few minutes here to talk about a few of the pests, but I also want to be mindful of Heather's time and everyone else's time so we can stay on track here. So the first occasional invader I'm going to cover is the order Dermaptera. This is the earwigs, and earwigs do get their name from the, oh, I'm sorry, I think someone's talking. If you could please mute. So earwigs do get their name from the superstition of them crawling into ears, burrowing into ears, and eating brain or laying their eggs in brain. So first off, right off the bat, everyone on this call, I'm sure already knows this. That is a myth. Nothing about that's true. Earwigs do not eat or consume anything on human bodies. And so if you do run into this question with any of your customers, right off the bat, you can say, nothing to worry about. These insects are actually scavengers. So they'll feed on like plant debris, sometimes on like pieces of root, broken down pieces of plant and leaves. Some are predators. And then people get intimidated by the large cerci, those big forceps on the back of their abdomen. They look scary, but those are used mainly as a defense mechanism for the earwigs. And occasionally they do use those to catch prey, but for the most part, they're going to catch prey with their mouth parts on the front. And earwigs are nocturnal. So if you're having a lot of earwig activity, that could be contributed from any lighting issues. So I would take a stab at talking to the customer about them leaving their lights on at night or checking out what kind of bulbs they're using. As far as lights go, there's some research out there. The warmer lights, LED lights are some good options there if they're looking to switch out their lighting. And so if we know that earwigs like to live in high moisture areas with a lot of plant debris, buildup of mulch, well, then that's where we're going to focus on potentially kind of knocking back some of that vegetation from the house. You can put down a residual around the perimeter as well. And then also, earwigs, because they're scavengers, they'll eat on a lot of things. They can eat on some of your granular baits as well. So if you're using granular baits for earwigs, that would be an option as well, aside from your liquid residuals. Okay, now I will jump into the diplodocus and chilopods. I think I'm saying that right. So the millipedes and centipedes here. And I really like to compare the two because they do get lumped in together, but there are some key differences. And the biggie here is that centipedes don't always have 100 legs. Millipedes don't have 1,000,000 legs. It's actually how many legs they have on each body segment. So centipedes have 1 pair of legs on a body segment. Millipedes have 2 pairs of legs on their body segment. And some of your centipedes can be kind of nasty. They have some poison glands. Most of the smaller centipedes that get into houses, and even house centipede, like they can bite, break the skin, and it can be a little bit painful. But honestly, for any of you that are joining in like the Southwest and areas that have the giant desert millipedes, their bite can be a little bit more ferocious. It's typically not going to cause any severe reactions, but can be very painful for a few days. And then in instances where there's like tropical millipedes, if someone has those as a pet, they do have pretty severe bites and can cause some reactions. So it really depends on the species there. And with millipedes, they're totally harmless. I love millipedes. I tend to pick up millipedes all the time. If I see them outdoors and I see some cool, colorful millipede. But if you do that, they will secrete a cyanide compound. So it looks like a lot of people think, oh, what is this like dark liquid? Literally looks like dark urine. No, that's a defensive secretion. That brown liquid they spit out is a cyanide compound, but it doesn't burn skin or anything. It does smell pretty bad, so your fingers might be stinky for a few hours, even a day or so, but it's completely harmless to humans. And then again with the millipedes, kind of one of the big issues we have are when we see these very large migrations, because we start seeing hundreds, thousands of millipedes. And really, when it comes to centipede millipede control, we want to focus on where are the cracks and crevices, especially for centipedes? Where are they hiding? We can go in, we could potentially dust. We can apply our products in those cracks and crevices, especially where the house centipedes are going to hang out. Focus on sealing any of those areas. And then for the millipedes, you can also put down some of your granular pesticides as well to provide a barrier around the perimeter. And I just want to quickly kind of cover this quote because I find it quite interesting. So this is from an actual USDA entomologist in the early 1900s, 1902, had this to say about the house centipede, because I personally think the house centipede is one of the creepiest looking bugs out there. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but it's a creepy bug. So it may often be seen darting across floors with very great speed, occasionally stopping suddenly and remaining absolutely motionless. Presently to resume its rapid movements, often darting directly at inmates of the house, particularly women, evidently with a desire to conceal itself beneath their dresses, and thus creating much consternation. Thankfully, I think a few factors here. We don't know the living situations. In the prisons, women were wearing skirts all the time there, so more opportunities. But at the end of the day, I think whatever's going on, those house centipedes just were looking in the wrong cracks and crevices. So very briefly, again, I have just a couple minutes, so I'm going to kind of fly through some of these groups to turn it over to Heather here. Springtails, most numerous insect in soil that you can find. They're super tiny, right? A lot of times they may be this lighter white color, more translucent looking, and they do jump. They have this thing called a furcula, this little appendage on the back of their abdomen, and it's almost like a little catapult. And so I don't know if you guys can see my finger, what I'm trying to do here, but it acts like a catapult, and they literally just fling themselves up in the air with that furcula tail appendage. Super moisture loving. So when we're talking about springtails, we're going to really want to focus, reduce moisture, and make sure you rake back the mulch and put your pesticide, your products into the soil underneath the mulch where springtails are living, and that'll help you get better control. Silverfish, Zygentoma, crazy bugs, super primitive. They've been around forever. Some of the first insects ever on Earth. And not surprising, if you look at these things, they look primitive, right? They look like they've been around for a really long time. So silverfish are going to be silver. Your bristletails fire brats are kind of like mottled brown looking, but their biology is going to be really similar. So they're going to feed on starchy items. They love paper items. They love cardboard boxes. If you have someone who's storing stuff in their attic or their basement in a lot of cardboard boxes, that could be an area for silverfish. So we can use dehumidifiers, again, cracks and crevices. But sometimes there are some species of silverfish that can actually withstand some pretty low humidities and high temperatures in attics and stuff as well. So if you're not getting control there, it could just be whichever, if you're trying, to reduce humidity, it could be one of the species that's not as affected. And so then you're really going to want to focus on those areas where you suspect the silverfish are hiding, and then potential food sources, other sources like some grains, cereals, even dried meats, silverfish will feed on as well. Okay, so we have made it to our first code word. Ellen, I believe, wants that in the chat. So if all of you could please put this code word, type it into the chat to help us make sure that we get so into the Q&A chat to make sure that everyone gets the CEU credits that needs it. So earwig, type that in, give it a couple seconds, and we'll keep flying through so I can turn over. Okay. So isopods, pill bugs, sow bugs, these things are adorable. I played with these all the time when I was a kid. What's the difference between, how do I know if it's a pill bug or sow bug? Well, pill bugs are your roly-polies. You disturb them, you poke at them, they're gonna roll up in cute little balls. Sow bugs don't do that. Not really a big issue, right? Many of these are gonna be harmless. Again, they like to feed on that decaying plant matter all around a house. They do have these plates that armor-like body, but really, again, focusing, make sure that your gutters are draining correctly, that you don't have standing water, that water's not coming back on the foundation. Really focus on controlling that moisture. And then very briefly, I'm going to get into Hemiptera and just a couple of the true bugs that we have issues with. Brown marmorated stink bug, a big one, comes from Asia, popped up in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1998. It has made its way, stomped across much of the Northeast, other areas, good concentration in Oregon as well. It's a pain, feeds on a ton of different plants, huge agricultural crop pest, and from our perspective, an overwintering pest, right? And so this is where, again, you see all that red in the Northeast, little spot in Oregon. So this is where you get some pretty heavy infestations, huge agricultural issues with the brown marmorated stink bug. But this is where it gets real. So this was like Pennsylvania, right when their populations were getting out of control. And these poor people lived next to a farm. They were one of the few houses, structures nearby. So you had all these brown marmorated stink bugs eating all these plants around this farm. And then guess what? Temperatures start dropping and they find this one house near this farm to go to. So, I mean, you get numbers in this like insane amount. These homeowners are literally doing what they can, sweeping them up by the bucket full, because at this point, you ain't going to be able to spray pesticides to control this, right? You're going to try to vacuum them, remove what you can, and then focus on prevention after you remove them and potentially start doing some spraying, doing some applications to all those potential entry points. And then the box elder bug, this one looks kind of like a milkweed bug, but box elder bug is going to have all those red markings. Again, an overwintering pest, so we're going to focus our pesticide applications, residual, or if you're doing some repellents, to all the areas where the box elder bug may enter the structure. You can also do a systemic, so maybe a neonic tree treatment if you do have a tree that's heavily infested. So a few options there. And with that, I know I flew through the last few minutes, but I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Brittany. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio coming in?
Yes, ma'am.
All righty. All right, folks, we officially hit the halfway point. I'm taking the baton and I'm going to get us to the finish line here. There are a couple additional pest groups as well as other arthropods and arachnid groups that will occasionally find their way into homes and structures that I'll be talking about. And I'm going to kick it off with first the flies, which of course are in the order Diptera. Now I really have one fly species or group that I want to focus on here and talk about, and that's the cluster flies. I think cluster flies are very fascinating organisms. Depending on what part of the country you're in or you're tuning in from, they tend to kind of show up and make their appearance or debut sometime in the fall or autumn time. when they are searching for those sunny sides of homes, the protected areas on the sides of homes, those overwintering sites. And of course, they can make their way into homes and become a big problem in there in large numbers. Well, they'll spend the winter months inside of homes and structures. Now, they're not breeding or reproducing inside the structure. That said, sometimes they can become a little bit more active, especially on a warmer day where they may come out of the wall voids or the attic in a clumsy attempt to find their way back outside. But like I said, they're not reproducing in the structure, so we're never going to see those immature stages. That includes egg, the larval stage, and pupal stage. And that's because the adult fly, she's laying her eggs in the soil outside. And out of that egg is going to hatch a larvae or a maggot. And what's fascinating about the life cycle of cluster flies is the larval maggot form of the fly is going to be parasitic on earthworms. So they hatch out of the eggs. They're going to go find an earthworm, and they're going to parasitize and feed on earthworms until they're ready to pupate. They're going to pupate in the soil, and then once they're done pupating, out emerges the adult cluster fly that you see pictured here. So there can be upwards of, 4 generations per summer. The adult cluster fly is a larger fly species, those characteristic red eyes. Kind of looks like a housefly, kind of robust. It's a little bit larger than a housefly. They're sometimes referred to as attic flies. And as far as their athleticism and agility, they're kind of more of a sluggish kind of fly. You can see they become a big problem in attics. You see that picture of the mass dead cluster fly pile there. Of course, they can get in piles like this and cluster up while they're alive as well. And when it comes to cluster fly management, one of the fundamental aspects is making sure that we have effectively sealed all of those openings, those entry points that they're using to gain access into the structure. And typically, the recommendation is to do that before they're overwintering behavior. So we want to exclude them and prevent them from coming in the structure sometime in the summer to late summer before they want to come in and overwinter in the fall. And that's because we want to avoid killing them in the home. Anytime you have dead organisms, including a bunch of dead flies, that can invite other pest problems. They can attract scavengers, other pests like carpet beetles or dermestids, and lead to additional infestations of other organisms that you don't want inside. As I mentioned, cluster flies are kind of a sluggish fly, so they're not going to make a very athletic or aggressive attempt to flee. And so that means they're pretty easy to vacuum up. You can vacuum up the dead cluster flies that you see pictured there, but the live ones will cooperate a little bit too. And the important thing to remember is when you do vacuum up your cluster flies is get rid of the vacuum, dispose of the contents, because they have been known to crawl out on occasion. All right, I'm going to jump over to the order Coleoptera. The next group I have in the lineup are the beetles. We know that, I think I have some interference maybe coming in. If you wouldn't mind muting your speaker, that'd be helpful. The beetles are going to be characterized by their hardened or modified forewings, which are known as elytra, and they kind of act as like protective covers over their more thinner, more membranous hindwings behind them. Very, very speciose group of insects, right? In North America, I think there's somewhere around 24,000 beetle species worldwide. There's over 350,000 species that have been recorded, and scientists are finding more all the time. So we're here to talk about the ones that'll commonly sneak their way into homes and structures. And of course, that means we have to first talk about probably the biggest occasional invader beetle offender. That sounded a lot better in my head. And that is going to be the multicolored Asian lady beetle. Now, like other lady beetles or ladybugs, that's a kind of a synonymous term, they're going to be voracious predators of aphids, of other plant pests that can feed on and damage the health of agricultural plants, garden plants, landscape plants, etc. And so because of the fact they are such voracious predators of these plant pests, they are considered to be in some cases beneficial to gardeners and farmers alike. However, because of their overwintering behaviors, and also there's a couple other not so pleasant aspects and attributes to the multicolored Asian lady beetle, they are seen as a nuisance or an annoyance to a lot of homeowners. So the multicolored Asian lady beetle does have some lookalikes out there. She does have some other coleopteran relatives that look quite similar. First and foremost, the multicolored Asian lady beetle will be slightly larger. They're about 1/3 of an inch in length, but that's not really an easy diagnostic feature to look for when you're in the field trying to figure out, is this a multicolored Asian lady beetle or some other native species? So what features should we look at to determine if this really is the multicolored Asian lady beetle? Can you tell by looking at these two images which one's the multicolored Asian lady beetle, and what did you look at to determine that or differentiate them one from another? If you're not sure, it's going to be a part on the thorax, specifically the pronotum. The pronotum is kind of this disc shape or shield-like structure behind the insect's head, and in this case, before their elytra or those hardened forewings. The pronotum is a feature on insects that we look at commonly because they'll usually have kind of distinct coloration or markings, kind of like cockroaches. We look at the pronotum in some cases to help us determine maybe what cockroach species we're looking at. And that's the structure that we're paying attention to here. And you can see that the multicolored Asian lady beetle has a cream-colored pronotum, and there's a very distinct marking or pattern on the pronotum. It's an M shape or a W shape, depending on what direction you're looking at it from. And so when you're talking about these beetles from individual to individual, beetle to beetle, they can look quite different. I mean, the name tells you in and of itself, it's multicolored. So some cases they can be more yellowish in color, orangish or reddish. So that's not really a reliable characteristic. The spots aren't really a reliable characteristic because these beetles can have big spots, little spots, few or no spots, and then all the way up to 19 spots. So that's also another characteristic that we can't really count on. We want to look for that M shape or W shape. And sometimes the thickness of that shape can be different between individual beetles. You can see this one here has a very thick M shape on its pronotum. Sometimes it can be thinner or even broken and disconnected in some places. So hopefully you can tell now and pick out which one's the multicolored Asian lady beetle between these two. So where are they from and how did they get here? Well, as the name implies, they are native to East Asia, and they were intentionally introduced here by the United States Department of Agriculture throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so they were brought in as a biological control agent. If you're not familiar with biological control, this is where we bring in a living organism. In this case, it's a beetle or an insect to suppress or control and manage a pest. It can be a plant pest in some cases, but in this case specifically, it's an insect pest. And so remember, multicolored Asian lady beetles are very effective and voracious predators of plant pests. So that's why they were brought in, to kind of control those agricultural pests. Specifically those pests that are often found on fruit producing or nut producing trees like pecans and apples. And of course, you know, once they were brought in, they started to establish throughout the United States and even into Canada. And the first field populations of multicolored Asian lady beetles were found in Louisiana back in the 1980s. And I think it was the early 90s when we realized that they were overwintering pests in homes. When a multicolored Asian lady beetle wants to lay her eggs, she will lay those yellow, oval, small eggs in clusters underneath the sides of leaves. And 2 to 3, 5 days-ish, out of the egg will hatch the larvae. And that's what we're looking at here, is that multicolored Asian lady beetle larva. And over the course of the next 12 to 14 days, they're going to be snacking on their favorite food source. And you can see here, this one's going to town on those aphids. The larval stage of these beetles is kind of creepy and unusual. You know, I've heard them referred to as tiny alligators. And, you know, being a Floridian, that was a little bit hard for me to kind of see that analogy. But when you think about your stereotypical immature beetle, like a grub that you'd find in your landscape or your yard, those look quite different than what we see here with the Asian lady beetles. As far as coloration goes, they're going to be darkish, bluish, blackish in color. They will have some patches of yellow or orange, and that'll become more pronounced as that larvae continues to grow and get bigger and develop. It looks kind of like a scary, intimidating little critter. It has those like fleshy spines and projections. Those are called forked tubercles. And they're just little fleshy projections on the backside of those larvae. This is the pupal stage. Of course, the pupae are non-feeding, non-moving stage, that transformative period between the tiny alligator-looking larva to what most people consider to be an okay insect as far as insects go. Most people are okay with a ladybug or a lady beetle in general. And so it's typically going to take about a month to go from egg to adult. There's multiple generations per year, and these beetles can live over a year and in some case up to 3. I love this picture. It gives you a good idea of the variation in color. You can see some of the yellow all the way up to orange and red. You see the variation in the spot size and the number. You also see some other species that are kind of worked into this beetle pile here. You see 2 black ones that have the 4 red dots. That's the 4-spotted spur-legged lady beetle, and that is native to the United States, but clearly outnumbered by their multicolored Asian lady beetle buddies here. So this is kind of what we see when you have big invasions of these beetles that'll come into people's house. They'll get in the corners and the cracks and the windows, and they can really affect somebody's quality of life or comfort in their home when they're this abundant. And outside of the abundance issue, they also have other not so pleasant aspects about their defensive mechanisms. These beetles can bite. It'll be temporary discomfort, but it does exacerbate entomophobia, which is a general fear of insects. Nobody likes bugs that can bite or sting, and they start to become concerned. Is this safe for my family, kids, dogs, and pets? And outside of the fact that they can bite on occasion, they do produce and secrete a very strong, foul, smelly fluid. And that fluid is secreted from their legs, and it's used as a defensive secretion against predators or threats. But the issue, beside it being stinky and smelly, is that it can stain light-colored surfaces. When it comes to multicolored Asian lady beetle management, there really is no quick fix, one-stop solution here. It's going to be a combination of things that we can use. Vacuum is going to be one of your good friends here. Exclusion methods and tactics, properly timed insecticide applications around the exterior and the perimeter. Those can help provide relief, but it's not going to stop every single beetle from coming in. Okay, now that we got multicolored Asian lady beetles out of the way, I'm going to talk about some other beetles that may wander into homes. These are definitely going to be ones that are for the heck of it category that Brittany mentioned earlier. Before I talk about them, I do want to preface and say that, you know, our customers' attitude, their reaction to a lot of these pests is going to vary quite dramatically from just, you know, I'd rather not have them around to full-on complete revulsion. And so that's why it's really important to have good identification skills that will let you know if the pest you're looking at is something to be concerned about. Is there a medical significance? Is there some sort of structural damage concern associated with that species, or is there not? And that knowledge is really going to help ease any anxiety or concern for our customers. And so let's talk a little bit about ground beetles. Ground beetles are accidentally going to find their way inside on some occasions. They're not going to be long-lived indoors. Those aren't the right conditions for them to thrive or reproduce. They're not going to be harmful, right? They're not going to be damaging structures. They're not going to be feeding on our food or damaging clothing for that matter. The one pictured at the top, that greenish, bluish, reddish one, that's a fiery searcher, kind of a fascinating, beautiful beetle if you're an entomologist. One of these, for the heck of it, wandered into one of my housemates or roommates back in college's room. Her room was by the door, and this guy wandered in, and it scared her. It's a big beetle, kind of intimidating if you're not a bug fan. It has kind of large pinchers or mandibles at the front of its mouth. And in addition to the fact that it looks scary to her, it produces a very, very foul, pungent odor. It released that odor. And so you have the creep factor of it being a beetle where it's not supposed to be in somebody's bedroom, and you have the stink factor. She was not a fan, and it's in my personal insect collection that I have. I was excited to find it, but she was not. Root weevils are another kind of beetle that can occasionally wander indoors. As the name suggests, the larval stage of root weevils are going to be feeding on the root systems of plants and crops. The one on the bottom with the racing stripes, that's a Diaprepes root weevil. I'm here in Houston, Texas, and last year I had several of these turn up in my house, on my porch. They were on my back deck. Major, major pest of citrus. I know in the state of Florida, Diaprepes root weevils are estimated to cause over $70 million in damage and economic losses every year. And so they are here in Texas. I think behind Florida and California, Texas is third for citrus production. So when you see these root weevils turn up, it's usually because there's a host plant nearby. And that's kind of the conclusion I came to with my personal situation with the Diaprepes root weevil, is maybe one of my neighbors has a citrus tree or some other host plant that is supporting that larval development. If you're like me, you probably have a pile of firewood out back for bonfires, or when things start to get cool, for firewood inside for your fireplace. And where you have firewood, you're going to have other critters that like to live in firewood as well. And that includes some beetle species here that are associated with firewood piles that may come out of the firewood. For instance, longhorn beetles, cerambicids with the long antennae pictured in the bottom left. Sometimes it's going to be flathead borers. You can see the larval stage of the flathead borer, kind of unusual round flat head that tapers off towards the back end. And then the emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is a beautiful beetle. It has that metallic iridescent green color, often used in jewelry, but they are a major destructive, damaging pest of forests around the country. So much so that the United States Department of Agriculture had quarantine rules in place for the movement of firewood in hopes that that would stop the spread or slow the spread of the emerald ash borer because of its association with firewood. I don't think that's a very effective strategy, but at least knowing what these beetles are and being able to be aware of the fact that they're not going to cause any damage to the structure or the people or stuff within our homes, that's important information for you to have. All right, I'm gonna move along here and talk about a different group. I'm gonna have to kind of pick up the pace here. We're getting close to that 1 hour mark. The next group of insects that I'd like to chat about are the crickets, specifically in the order Orthoptera. Now, crickets are omnivores. They're scavenger insects. They're feeding on a variety of plant and animal material. There's lots of species found around the United States, and they're an important food source for a lot of animals that we like: birds, amphibians, reptiles, even small mammals. Now, typically, generally speaking, they're going to be more active at night, and in the daytime, they're going to be seeking shelter in those damp, dark, cool places, sometimes basements underneath logs, that kind of thing. And the issue with crickets can range anywhere from simple annoyance. There's a couple in your house that are chirping that creates a disturbance or annoyance, all the way up to damage. Especially when you're talking large numbers of crickets, they can feed on and damage man-made materials. There's a couple of crickets that I want to mention here briefly that you should be familiar with, starting from the left going to the right. House crickets. House crickets can be found throughout eastern United States. For whatever reason, as far as I'm aware, not in the peninsular part of Florida. They are in the panhandle, and so that kind of causes scientists to scratch their head a little bit. There's also established populations out in Southern California, but this is an insect that we breed because, one, they're a really good fishing bait. Two, they're a good food source for our pets. If you're a weirdo like me and you've got pet tarantulas, I buy crickets all the time at the pet store. Field crickets, that's a dark brown or black in color cricket next to the house cricket there. These guys definitely prefer to live outdoors, but they can make their way inside, especially when the conditions outside become unfavorable. It's too hot, it's too dry, it's too wet, whatever the case may be, they may be trying to come inside to find more favorable conditions. Next, we have Mormon crickets. Mormon crickets are technically not a cricket. They are short-winged, shield-backed katydids. They look like a fat grasshopper. They're native to the western United States, and they're non-flying, kind of ground-dwelling crickets. And I've learned that drought conditions can kind of spur on these Mormon cricket outbreaks like what we saw this year. And what ends up happening is these outbreaks will last for years in some cases, and it'll be just a big band of millions of these crickets that are moving through, and they cause serious economic damage to agriculture, cropland, rangeland, all sorts of things as they move through city to city and town to town, just devouring everything in its path. Next, we have camel crickets. Camel crickets kind of have that arched back. They don't fly, they don't sing. They have very long hind legs. They try to want to stay out of the way of people, like those dark, damp areas around basements or cellars. And then next to that, we have Jerusalem crickets. Now, this is a cricket that kind of creeps people out. It has that very obvious orange round head. It has an abdomen with that tan and black banding that looks kind of like danger. Is this something I need to be worried about? So it looks creepy, but overall Jerusalem crickets are going to be harmless. They live underground. That's where they're tunneling. They're feeding on insects and non-woody vegetation and tubers. So in that aspect, maybe they can cause a little bit of damage to turf and vegetables or vegetation, but these guys, they're harmless little ones. One of the big issues with, you know, a lot of the pests that we talk about here for occasional invaders is sometimes they can just show up in these huge numbers and just inundate an area. And that's obviously what happened with the Mormon crickets outbreaks that happened this past summer in Western United States. Okay, so they show up in the millions. They're all over everybody's houses, their property. In addition to that, they are getting run over on the roads. And so they caked up into this thick layer on the road, and that affected the driving conditions in some states. So much so that the Department of Transportation stepped in and plowed up the slick, gooey cockroach remains. So there's a lot of them. They're affecting driving conditions. They're eating. Remember, they're eating a lot of plants and vegetation as they move, and they smell bad. They stink, as you can see from that New York Times headline there. And so our PMP friends out west were quite busy with that Mormon cricket problem. When it comes to cricket control, you know, we're finding and securing and closing and sealing those entry points, the holes and gaps around doors and windows and other structural openings. In addition to that, we're also paying attention to the lighting. As Brittany said, the lighting can be an issue for cricket invasions and infestations, right? We may want to make recommendations to a less attractive yellow light as opposed to using a white or neon or mercury vapor light. Also, when it comes to cricket control, in addition to those tactics, there's a lot of really effective pesticide products, insecticides, whether that's a bait, granular bait, residual product around the exterior and the perimeter, IGRs. We have several options to incorporate into our cricket control programs. All right, we have made it to our second code word. The code word here is cricket. I'll give you a few seconds to type that word cricket into the Q&A chat box. This should be the final code word for CEU credits that require this. Code word cricket. Type and submit. All right, I got a few minutes here, so I'm going to jump over and talk about the next group and the final group here of occasional invaders, and that's the spiders. The spiders are going to be characterized by two body regions. We know insects have head, thorax, abdomen. Spiders are going to have a cephalothorax, so it's like cephala meaning head, squished together with the thorax into one body region with the abdomen. On that cephalothorax, spiders are going to have 8 legs. They're not going to have any antennae, and of course they have their chelicerae, their fangs, and they're able to inject venom. I think as of last year, there was somewhere around 50,000+ species that have been named and described by taxonomists. So aside from Antarctica, they're found on every continent and almost every habitat around the world. They're very, very successful and abundant organisms. And of course, as we know, they have fangs, so they can kill and feed on their prey. So 99.99% of them are predators. However, there is an exception to the rule. And the more I learn about the world around me, I realize that that's usually the case. There's always kind of one outlier or one exception to the rule. There's an article that came out of National Geographic several years ago, and it talks about this jumping spider species, Bugurica plingi, and it is the world's only mostly herbivorous or vegetarian spider. Absolutely fascinating. If that piques your interest, I encourage you to check that out. A quick note on spider anatomy. I've gotten this question before. I think it's good to point out here. If you count the appendages starting at the spider's rump and going towards the face, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 appendages. Why does this spider have 5 legs? When you take a look at the anatomy of a spider, you'll see that those appendages that kind of look like small legs towards its mouth, those are actually its pedipalps. Really, really important sensory structures on a spider that they use to kind of taste and sense the world around them. They use it to help shape their webs. And also for male spiders, that's going to be a differentiator for how you tell a male spider from a female spider. Male spiders will have very swollen pedipalps that they use to mate with. So really, when it comes to spider anatomy, the head, the cephalothorax, that's the business end. It has the legs, it has the pedipalps, eyes, fangs, and venom. So I'm going to quickly fly through a couple of the common spiders that are found in homes and structures around the United States. Of course, that includes cellar spiders. Cellar spiders are in the family Pholcidae, and you can see this female here. I probably should have turned that picture 180 degrees, but she'll hang upside down in her irregular cobweb, and she'll be found in places with high humidity, underneath cabinets, sinks, cellars, that kind of thing. And she carefully wraps her eggs, her case, her sac, which can contain anywhere between 25 upwards of 60 eggs. And so as far as spider or cellar spider management goes, there is no evidence that these spiders will bite people, that they are not medically important. In addition to that, they kind of want to be left alone. They're doing their own thing and staying in one place. And they're feeding on pests in and around the structure. So we can share that with our customers to help them see that maybe there's some added benefit to having a friendly cellar spider around, but that doesn't fly with all of our customers. They have a spider, they want it gone. Some of the things that we can do is removing the webs, vacuuming up the spider, get rid of the evidence, and then also change the environment where it's living. You get this question a lot. Who's the daddy long leg? You have the cellar spider on the left and a harvestman or a pilionis on the right. And there's this myth that the daddy long leg is the most venomous, deadly spider on earth. Its mouth parts are just too small to bite humans. And that's not true for either of these, and here's why. The harvestman, the critter on the right, that's not even a spider. They're closely related to spiders, but harvestmen don't have fangs. They don't have venom glands. They're not going to be able to envenomate anything. The cellar spider on the left, that is a spider. It does have fangs, but there is no scientific or medical evidence that they have any sort of medical significance. Okay, wolf spider, that one gives people the heebie-jeebies. It's a kind of a large, hairy spider with long legs. We tend to see wolf spiders. Sometimes the females will carry around their egg sac in their mouth, and out of that egg sac hatches the spiderlings, and they crawl onto mom's back, adding to that creep factor. When it comes to wolf spiders, typically, if we see them in and around a structure, there's a food source there that they're feeding on, and maybe that's where we focus our management strategy on, is when you take away the food source, that's going to impact the wolf spider presence and activity around the home. We have a couple of medically important species. Brown recluse spider, we know to look for that fiddle shape. If you're really wanting to confirm the identification, look at the eyes. Brown recluse spiders are going to have 6 eyes and 3 pairs, 2 in the middle and 2 on the side. So have a hand lens ready to confirm that if your customers, for instance, have captured the spider, they have it in a Ziploc bag, and they want you to confirm whether or not it's a brown recluse. Black widow, characteristic black female widow here with that hourglass shape on her abdomen. Very, very common throughout the warmer states of the U.S. When you're talking about spiders in the indoors, besides finding ways to exclude them and keeping them out of the building in the first place, sometimes it's just as simple as vacuuming them up, or a shoe, or scooping them up and getting them outside. Outdoor management, especially long-term residual control of spiders, that's going to be a bit more challenging, but there's things that we can do that we have in our IPM toolbox that can help, including removing the webs, addressing those food sources, and there's also some really effective products that we can use, like residual products and dusts, to help with spider issues around structures. All right, I really need to put a bow on this thing. Let's go ahead and talk about some key takeaways when it comes to occasional invader management. You know, as we discussed, these can be tricky pests, and it's really going to be up to the customer to determine whether or not they have a problem here. And it's going to depend on the education and communication that we have to share with them to let them know whether or not any mitigation or management tactics are necessary. Now, generally speaking, with occasional invaders, we can be effective at managing them when we can address those conducive conditions, those conditions around the home and structure that's allowing them to live there and thrive there in the first place. In many cases, that's non-chemical methods, right? We're talking about sanitation, we're talking about exclusion, we're talking about habitat modification, vacuuming, making recommendations about better lighting. So those are non-chemical examples. And then there's also several repellents, residual products that we can incorporate into our strategy that'll also be effective. So we're really leaning on all aspects of the IPM pyramid. Does it always need management, as we talked about? Not in every case. And so we want to have an open mind open-minded assessment, I should say, a thorough inspection, and we need to be able to communicate that and share that with our customers if we've determined that maybe mitigation or management isn't necessary in this instance, and here's why. Oftentimes that reassurance or that knowledge is going to make our customers happy, and they're going to have more trust and faith in the services that we provide. So I'm going to round this out here with a quote from Sherlock Holmes. "It is my business to know what other people don't know." We're looking for tiny bits of clues and information in the environment. And, you know, customers can go buy pesticides at the store, but what they're really paying for is your knowledge, your expertise, your ability to identify the pest. You know what's perpetuating the problem. You know where they're living and why they're thriving there, the things that are you know, contributing to the issue at hand, and you know what the best course of action is going to be to take care of the problem. And that's really where a lot of the value is. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Ellen. I think she's received some questions that have come in from our attendees.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. So at this time, we're going to do a couple questions. Maybe we'll just do one or two just to keep it short on time. So for the first one, we'll do, how often do elder bugs bite people, and is the bite harmful, and does this pest spread any diseases?
Sure, I can take that one. So box elder bugs, it is very rare for them to bite. They are a hemipteran, and, you know, they do feed on plants, so they have a sucking mouth part, so they can penetrate the skin. However, with that piercing sucking mouth part, they're not going to suck blood, and that is going to only happen if you really disturb them. So don't spread disease. Not really a biting pest. It can happen, but it's rare.
All right, and we'll just do one more really quick to wrap it up. Why do warmer or yellow bulbs attract fewer insects?
Sure. So I can also take that one just to wrap it up. I know we're short on time here. So with the yellow bulbs, they are less attractive to bugs. There was a study that was done recently. It's very interesting. They looked at incandescent lights, halogens. They also looked at LED lights, and they looked at cool LED lights and warm LED lights. And they found LED lights were less attractive, but you definitely want to get the ones that have the warmer tones, because essentially the yellow lights, the insect bug lights, don't produce as much of the wavelength that's more in the blue spectrum that's attractive to insects. So go with the more yellow ones.
All right, and then to wrap things up here, thank you guys so much for the great presentation today. Now we'll wrap up the live event. Thank you everyone who attended Managing Occasional Invaders, the Unwanted and Unwelcome Guests, brought to you by PMP Magazine, with our sponsor of the event, Control Solutions, Inc. If we were not able to answer your questions during the presentations or Q&A session, your questions will be forwarded to the speakers to be addressed via email. After the webinar is complete, and a link will be available to take the CEU credit quiz. It is available now, so you can take the link that is on the screen, or it is available on the upper right-hand side of this page. The quiz will be available for 1 week until September 14th, 4 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central Time. You will receive your certificate if you meet the requirements within 2 to 3 weeks after September 15th, 2023. A recording of this webinar and other upcoming webinars from PMP will be posted on pmp.net/webinars on September 15th, and the CEU credit will no longer be available. The quiz will be emailed to you shortly. Follow the instructions and take the quiz as soon as possible. And reminder, on-demand viewers will not be eligible for the quiz or CEU credits. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Heather and Brittany with their emails below. Thank you for attending, and we hope you join us again for another great webinar.
Thank you.